edition of the International Film Festival and Forum on Human Rights, tonight for a discussion titled What Future for the Black Lives Matter Movement? Following the death of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his murderer, George Zimmerman, in 2013, Patrisse Cullors took action. Alongside Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi, she created the hashtag Black Lives Matter to expose ongoing anti-Black racism. Black Lives Matter has since then evolved into a global movement, a movement that's still growing. Yesterday, we had a conversation with Angela Davis, who mentioned the movement and its founders, and tonight, we're very honored and grateful to welcome Patrisse Cullors, artist, political strategist, and founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, for a conversation animated by Rokhaya Diallo, journalist, writer, and filmmaker. I wish you all a very good evening.
L'art doit quelquefois prendre la place de la politique, quand la politique, pour des raisons économiques, est bloquée.
It's important to be able to write about violence with the same intimacy with which I write about love.
We created the kind of community that allowed us to give expression to our dignity.
Black lives matter.
African young people.
Actually, I'm not a hero.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being connected tonight. Thanks to the festival for making that transatlantic conversation possible. Good evening, or should I say good afternoon, Patrisse Cullors?
It's actually still morning.
Oh, wow, you're so far away. First of all, before saying what you stand for, I have a question. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm a bit tired. There's been a lot going on, obviously, here stateside, but I'm grateful and glad to be in this conversation.
Thank you. So I'm sure that you told that story a lot, but could you tell us about how Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement started, and what you had in mind in the time of its foundation?
Sure. We started in 2013 and really was in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman. Many of us were upset and disturbed that this man could kill and get away with it. And so Alicia Garza went to social media and she wrote a love note to Black people and then said Black Lives Matter. And then I put a hashtag in front of it. And from there, Opal Tometi joined us to create the trio. And we really started to develop the framework for Black Lives Matter. We have been there's been multiple iterations of our movement. At the beginning, it was a hashtag that we used to help the movement go viral. We used the phrase Black Lives Matter in protests. And then we developed a really, clear, all right, we want to be an organization. So Black Lives Matter is also a global organization. And there are three parts of our global organization. There's the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, which is a global foundation that supports Black liberation across the world. And we have a network specifically in the United Kingdom, Canada, and the US. And then there's our Black Lives Matter PAC. And here in the States, you have to have a political action committee in order to have a direct conversation about candidates and legislation. And then we have Black Lives Matter Grassroots, which is our chapters who are in charge of the grassroots power building of our network.
So the storytelling about Black Lives Matter tends to erase the skills and strategy required to build such a successful movement. It is told like a kind of fairy tale, but you were already a trained activist when it started. Can you tell about your grassroots work prior to Black Lives Matter and the critical theory that you had to learn before?
Yes, that's a very good point. We sort of talk about Black Lives Matter as sort of this like mythical origin story, but we rarely talk about the work that the three of us were doing before then. I had been trained as an organizer and activist from the time I was 17 years old. And I had been doing work before Black Lives Matter on different fronts, environmental justice. I had been doing work around ending the school to prison pipeline. And then I would soon do work that was specifically focused on making sure that the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department was no longer torturing people inside its jails. And so my work has spanned for years now, 20 plus years in this movement and organizing. And I think it's really what helped me develop Black Lives Matter was all the years of training.
Young Black Americans are overrepresented on social media, and Black Lives Matter is a perfect example of a new kind of human rights activism with online pressure and high visibility. How does it change activism, and how did you use that special presence and your skills to make social media useful to expand your movement?
Yes. I understood social media as a place to democratize voices, as a place to really lift up the voices of so many people who didn't get mainstream media attention. We have to remember that, when Black Lives Matter starts, there isn't mainstream media attention around our movement or the people who started it. There was a ton of backlash, but not a ton of us being able to represent what we were saying and what we believed in. So social media really becomes this place where we get to say what's ours. We get to share a different kind of conversation, and we get to curate that conversation.
Do you think that you pushed the mainstream media to cover some topics that weren't covered before? And how do you measure the change from 2013 to today?
Yes, definitely. Not just push the mainstream media to cover Black Lives Matter, but we also push the mainstream media to communicate about Black Lives Matter differently. So much of what was happening around Trayvon, especially his trial, was how racist it was. It was clear that it wasn't George Zimmerman that was on trial for murder. It was Trayvon Martin being on trial for his own, really being communicated that he's the one who got himself caught up in being murdered. He was no longer a victim. And I think that we've had a different conversation now. Media, obviously we have right-wing media that is terrible, but mainstream media in particular is talking differently about Black Lives Matter and Black people in general.
And yesterday, the guest of the festival was Angela Davis. She became famous in the 70s after the civil rights movements. How do you relate to the civil rights movement, and what difference does your generation make?
I think it's important that we talk about our movement as part of a long legacy. I don't see. There are differences because our movement, it looks different and it's a different time, but it's a part of the same legacy. It's a legacy of calling for the freedom of Black people. It's a legacy of Black liberation, not just in our country, not just in the United States, but also across the globe. This is a global movement, and it's very important that people understand that. There's a reason why it's not African American Lives Matter. It is Black Lives Matter because it connects us to Black people around the globe, politically and racially. So, so much of our work is about that.
And there was a conversation at the beginning of Black Lives Matter with the difference about the difference between your generation and the civil rights movement's generation, and all that conversation about looking respectable or not. What do you have to say about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a really clear trend that respectability is, respectability isn't it. That respectability is not going to save us. That, we can wear, suits and dresses, but that's not actually going to get us free. And that we should be able to be the whole of who we are as Black people. And still deserve our life and still deserve our freedom.
And what is interesting about the narrative that was made at the early years of Black Lives Matter in comparison with the civil rights movement is the fact that when Dr. Martin Luther King was still alive, he was demonized and it was not popular. And the image that he has today is very different. And I saw in an interview that you paralleled the fact that Black Lives Matter was depicted in a very negative way, whereas there was kind of construction of an opposition between you and the former movements. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that every movement has its naysayers. Every movement has a group of people who are skeptical of it, especially when it's young Black people, but particularly when it's, young Black women, queer women. And when we started Black Lives Matter, we were younger. Many of us are queer. We identify as queer, and we're Black, and we're women. And so, I think there has been a real sort of at the beginning a knee-jerk reaction. Well, these people can't be leaders. They don't look like the leaders that we're used to. They're not Christian. They're not Black men. They're not wearing suits. I think it very much confused people how to relate to us. And I think that's changing, and I think that has changed over the years.
You just mentioned the fact that Black Lives Matter was founded by Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and yourself, three women, among which two identify as queers. You said in an interview that Black women have been at the helm of social movement for a very long time. And I can add that they never have been that visible as they are today. Could you tell me more about women in the Black movement in history and today?
Yes. I am really, it's really important for people to understand that, I've heard questions in the past where people ask, well, why do you think Black women are more at the forefront of our movement than they were in the past? And I'm like, no. That's not the right way to think about it. It's not the right question. Black women have always been at the center of movements, but they were not centered. They were not visibilized. And so we are changing that narrative. We are saying, and this is, I have to give it to social media. It's allowed Black women to position ourselves and to remind people, you can't take away the fact that we are the architects of this movement. And I think that's really important.
And how do you put in the middle of the story the fact that two of you are queer, and several of the activists are queer, and it's not something new since, for example, Bayard Rustin, who was close to Dr. Martin Luther King, was also a gay man. So, and it was not told in the official history. How do you try to change the narrative about the former activists?
I think many of us were, especially queer Black folks in our movement, were looking for former queer people to look to in our movements. And I think, what we've seen time and time again is us uncovering who people were and how they identified, from James Baldwin to Audre Lorde, who was open and out, but didn't get the due she deserved until she passed away. and Bayard Rustin, who was the architect of the March on Washington. And I think it's been really important for us movement leaders who are Black and queer to lift up that history, just like we lift up the history of Ella Baker, who, trained so many civil rights leaders. She was at the very, she was at the center of so much of what happened during the civil rights movement.
You said earlier that you are the executive director of the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation that was created in July 2020. Why was the foundation created 7 years after the movement? Does it have to do with the fact that it went global?
So our foundation didn't start in 2020, but our shift changed a bit in 2020. So Black Lives Matter Global Network and our institution, the actual organization, has existed now for about 5 years. So the first 2 years, from 2013 to about 2015, we did not have an organization. We did not have an institution. We changed that in 2015 because we saw lots of Black people wanting to organize under the banner of Black Lives Matter. And so we wanted to have an institution where we can house Black people and chapters in particular, people who are doing amazing work across the country. But in 2020, a lot changed with the uprisings in Minnesota and Minneapolis, with George Floyd protests and Breonna Taylor protests. Black Lives Matter was able to really raise money that we hadn't ever raised prior to 2020. And from there, we decided to start a foundation to be a philanthropic institution, as well as a think tank. And so we've, at this point, we've now given over $21 million back into the Black community.
And what kind of support do you give to the Black community?
What kind of support?
Yes, like what is the use, for example, of the money? Does it go to education to care?
Oh, got it.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. So we created a whole social impact report, and the first orgs that we prioritized were Black LGBT organizations that were both giving services to Black LGBT folks, but also providing support and really shaping legislation for Black people, Black queer people in particular. We recognize that Black LGBT orgs are the orgs that are the least funded, the least supported. So we wanted to give directly back to those organizations.
So after the murder of George Floyd, the outrage went global. How do you explain that what happened in the US resonated so much all around the world and also here in Europe? And did you expect that? And how did you connect with the movement all around the world?
So, yeah, I think that our movement made global headlines in 2020, but the movement's been global for quite some time. In 2015, one of my first trips outside of the US was to the United Kingdom, where I met many of the people who are still part of Black Lives Matter UK, and where I really supported Black folks in the UK to use Black Lives Matter as a way to communicate about what was happening in their country. Or Black Lives Matter Canada, for instance, where I met with their team really early on. It was either in late 2014 or early 2015 when I met with BLM Canada to really help them shape the work that they're doing, and they're doing incredible work. So I don't want to say that the movement went global in 2020. I think that will undermine so much of the work that had already been happening. But it made global headlines in 2020. And I've been able to connect with quite a few of the folks across the globe, from people in Australia to people in Sweden, that Black people who are using Black Lives Matter as a place to have a conversation about anti-Black racism in their own countries.
State violence also affects female bodies, but it's not really visible in the mainstream narrative. There is a story that was very sad that happened before the murder of George Floyd, which is the story of Breonna Taylor. Could you tell us about her and how you were part of the struggle to make her life matter?
Yes, Breonna Taylor, I think, and so much of whether it's Breonna Taylor or Sandra Bland or Waukesha Wilson or Riddell Jones or Megan Hockaday, there are so many Black women who've been impacted by state violence and whose names are not lifted up. Part of the work of our movement and the work of Black Lives Matter is to remind people how important Black women are. In fact, Black Lives Matter launched a campaign called Black Women Are Divine, where we hosted events across the country to uplift Breonna, but also to uplift the other Black women in our lives. We often don't give our people flowers while they're still alive, and we really wanted to honor Black women. And then we created a video to share the divinity of Black women. And we'll continue to do that. We'll continue to lift Black women up.
And do you think that there has been a change in the way, in the coverage of the death of Black women due to state-sponsored violence?
Yes and no. I do think there's still a way in which we say it differently, where we primarily focus on Black men and what has happened to them. But I do believe that there is more on the ground initiative to lift up Black women's names.
So 2020 was also a very special year due to the pandemic. The COVID-19 overwhelmingly affected communities of color in the US as well as in Europe. How did you take that matter of fact in your activism?
Yes, I mean, with COVID, I really did try to position the work that I'm doing, especially here in Los Angeles, around incarceration and people who are, incarcerated in jails and prisons who've been impacted by COVID. We have both sued. We have a lawsuit against the county here in Los Angeles around how they've neglected the rights and the health of people inside the jails. But we've also created more infrastructure. We've created a COVID-19 coalition to respond to the issues of violence against communities inside the jails in particular, and their family members who've had little access to them. So that's been a big focus at the local level, and at the national level. We've been really supporting how to get information out to Black people around COVID-19, how to be not just about personal responsibility, but how to challenge our national government around how they related to COVID-19, obviously for the years that Donald Trump was in office. And now, just recently, we finally got the COVID relief, our second COVID relief package passed. And so many working families, Black families in particular, will be able to receive some money, but it's not enough. People in the United States have only received one single check. No relief. It's been dire here. It's been hell. And it's really unfortunate that the government that we had didn't provide the resources that they should have so that we could have prevented so much death and so much suffering.
You just mentioned the prison system. It appears that Black people make up just 30% of the US population, but they account for 37 of the homeless, and they are also overrepresented in jail. And there is this idea that the prison system is very connected to the history of slavery. You promote abolition against the global US state violence, injustice, and devastation. I quote your words. What should be abolished according to you, and how?
So I am an abolitionist. I believe in the abolishing of prisons, police, jails, detention centers, ICE, surveillance, and courts. I think those entities are vestiges of chattel slavery, and we should have never entered into a prison system as we ended, chattel slavery. So the reason why I believe in abolition is because I believe that no human being deserves to be in a cage. I believe that we should have autonomy over our bodies and our lives. And I believe that through abolition, we can create better institutions of care. We can create a system of transformative justice, a system that really looks to the dignity of human beings.
And can you, for those who don't know the connection between the history of slavery and mass incarceration in the US, how did it happen to go from slavery, segregation to mass incarceration? What are the links, and how does it have an impact on the fact that Black people are overrepresented in the jail system?
Sure. As the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, there was obviously an amendment, a 13th Amendment that was created. And the 13th Amendment essentially said that slavery was abolished, except for if you've committed a crime and inside a jail or prison cell. And so it's in our very Constitution, it's in our very amendments that slavery would still exist under a certain pretense. And if people haven't read it yet, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow details how our system is a system that has created second-class citizens, and many of those are Black people.
Thank you. There is also a very good documentary from Ava DuVernay, The 13, which is on Netflix. You were just mentioning the government. After 4 years of presidency of Donald Trump, Joe Biden was elected. I know that you were not a supporter of him initially, but it happened that 91% of Black women voted for Biden, and that the number of white women who voted for Donald Trump increased in 2020. Do you think that there is an uncrossable line between white women and women of color?
I didn't fully understand the question.
Like the number of Black women who voted for Joe Biden is very high. It's 91%, yeah. And white women voted more for Donald Trump last year than they did in 2016. So it means that they didn't really follow the same agenda regarding the election, even if Donald Trump was explicitly sexist. So yeah. What does it tell about maybe a line that is a racial line that even exists between women in the US?
Yes. Great question. It's a question that folks have been asking for a long time, not just in this election cycle, but obviously through the feminist movement and first wave feminism, second wave feminism. It's why Alice Walker doesn't identify as a feminist. She identifies as a womanist. So, I think that racism obviously impacts all communities, and it impacts the community of women as well. I think there has been a deep alliance for white women to their race versus their gender, and a lack of alliance to Black women in particular. So while it's always shocking to hear those numbers and see those numbers, it's not a surprise, and it means that there's more work to be done. White folks in particular need to be doing more work to organize white women to be on board as anti-racist, and to see that their liberation is bound into ours as well.
And do you think that do you see that work being done?
Yeah, I do. It's not popular work, but I definitely know many organizations and people who are doing the work to call in white people and white women in particular.
There was, after the election, a very shocking event, which was the attack on the Capitol before the inauguration of Joe Biden. How did you analyze that attack, and what does it mean to Black lives, seeing such a number of people going to just deny democracy?
Yeah, it was hard to process. That wasn't an easy experience. That was really almost like an outer body experience as the Capitol was being destroyed. To know a couple things, to see the police be woefully inequipped, but also, to recognize that our country was ill prepared to really deal with white supremacist attacks. I always talk about the January 6th riots as a part of a long legacy and history of white supremacist violence against our communities and white supremacist violence against the state. There's this idea that, these white supremacists just popped up during Donald Trump's presidency, but that's not true. White supremacist groups have been around for hundreds of years and have impacted the daily lives of Black and brown people in particular. So those riots were terrorist attacks, and it's important we say that. In the same breath, it's important to be reminded that while we call them terrorist attacks, we can't allow them to then use that to further terrorists' laws. We have really strong laws around terrorism. They're just not used against white people.
And do you think that it will change after the attack of the Capitol? Do you think that there is now the awareness of the fact that terrorism can come from and has been coming from white supremacists for a long time?
There's a commitment from the White House, and specifically from the new Attorney General Merrick Garland, to really challenge white supremacist groups. Black Lives Matter is going to be doing the same thing, and we'll continue to do that, and we'll see what happens.
And so, after the presidency of Trump, the American society is very divided. Do you think that there is a way to heal the system, or to change it, and to bring the population together?
Oh. It's a very philosophical question. Of course, there's a way to heal and bring people together. I think that's a yes. The question is really, do people want to be together? Do people want to heal and be together? That is the question to me. And what will it take? Black people in particular, Black organizers specifically, we've done everything we can to bring people together. It's now other people's turn to show up and play their part.
And do you see them playing their part? And do you have any hope in that new government to be part of that?
I have hope for this government to play some role in bringing the country together. Part of bringing the country together, though, is about accountability. There's a line, there's no unity without accountability. We really need to be accountable. We really need accountability to come first. I think it's going to take time.
You were recently named by Time magazine among the 100 most influential women. what do you make of that influence? And was it something that you were expecting or that you could imagine a few years ago?
No, no, I don't do the work for awards and accolades. Sometimes those awards and accolades are a distraction. I'm appreciative of the honors. And I'm really grateful for it. And for me, I'm more interested in Black people's freedom. If that is something that I can achieve, and if I can get us closer to changing the material conditions for Black people, then I'll feel good about it.
And so how do you work with the elected official? How do you maybe pressure them or try to push new laws and to influence them in their law-making work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a multi-pronged strategy to changing systems. One strategy is using mass protests, which you've seen happen last summer. Another strategy is protests. Not all the protests are mass protests. I've been to protests where it's 30 of us. But then there's also electoral engagement. I just had a meeting this morning with one of our country's representatives, Representative Karen Bass, and we talked about different ways we can work together so that we can champion some of Black Lives Matter agenda. We have to challenge, we have to have the right balance of challenging our elected officials and then working with them as well. And I think we're working on that together right now.
Thank you. I've read in your interview that you were talking a lot about wellness, and mental and emotional health are often neglected when it comes to activism. It's been neglected for decades, and many activists have just died because of their work. We can think about Erica Garner, for example, who just died because of a heart attack, and she despite being a young woman, she was the daughter of Eric Garner, who died upon police brutality. What do you do, and what do you recommend to activists to feel well?
Yes, I love this question. It's something I think about all the time and I talk about all the time. But one of the things that we have to remember is this work is going to be here for a long time, and that it doesn't do us a service or anybody else a service to work ourselves into the ground, to burn ourselves out. And much of the work that I try to do is to remind people about what their wellness and regimen is. Also, I think it's really important that we have community that cares for us. It's so much work going on. It's so hard, and we need to create communities of care.
And so how do you do that? And how do you, for example, allow yourself not to be available? Because I'm sure that you get so many requests and you feel like having the need of responding to all the requests, but do you allow yourself to withdraw from the public sphere and from all your activities and just to take care of yourself?
Yes, I do. And that's a practice that I've continued to work on for the last 20 years. It's not always been like that, but it is a practice that I've centered to be able to unplug and take care of myself. I just was talking to a friend this morning. I have a long work day today. And after I get off of work, I'm going to turn my phone off and just unplug and hang out with my family.
And you said also that Black people should cultivate the imagination to build a different world. How do you do that?
Oh, how do you cultivate an imagination to build a different world? First thing is to recognize what parts of your imagination has been stolen. We are one of the first things colonialism does is steal your imagination. They take away your ability to believe that something can be different. And so that's our work. Our work is to be able to see how things are different and to imagine them differently. abolition is all about imagining a new world. We have to imagine that prisons and jails don't exist, and that there's a new way to be in relationship to each other. I've been saying this for years. Someone imagined handcuffs, someone imagined a jail cell, and it was created. So we can imagine something else.
And you also said that with activism, you tend to focus to everything that is negative because so many things are going wrong. How do you distance yourself from that in order to think positively?
I think that we have to both take on issues, the terrible issues, the horrible issues, but we also have to center joy and thriving communities. You know, there's this myth that Black Lives Matter is about Black death, that's our primary focus, about Black people dying at the hands of the state. That's not our primary focus. Our primary focus is Black life. It's about thriving Black communities.
You are also an artist. What is the role of arts in the struggle?
It's massive. You can, first of all, you know, we could talk about the Black arts movement and the history of the Black arts movement and where it comes from and who was a part of it and what it was trying to do and what it did do. I believe that we are in a very similar moment around Black arts and around TV, film, fine art. There's a Black renaissance happening right now, and there's some powerful Black people leading it who are amazing individuals whose politics are about shaping a new Black life.
Thank you very much for the very positive message. I think that I will now share the virtual floor with the audience who have sent me some questions for you that I just got. So there is a first question from Sophie, which is what changes do you see in the American society following the Black Lives Matter movement?
It's a very good question. A lot of changes. Number one, I'll say the way that we've seen conversations happen around anti-Black racism are completely different. We know that across industries, there has been a reckoning around race and a reckoning around what's happening inside of companies and corporations. We've seen a huge movement to defund law enforcement. You all can check out a new website that we helped launch alongside a bunch of other organizations called defundpolice.org. So, yeah.
Could you tell more about the movement's Defund Police and the fact that it was criticized also by the former President Barack Obama?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the defund police movement was really about challenging who's getting all the money and how they're getting it. We've seen time and time again, healthcare be slashed, housing services be slashed, and all the other things be slashed. And yet, police budgets were never slashed. In fact, oftentimes police budgets were lifted up and raised. So we need to be a part of developing and challenging police and their role in our communities.
There is another question from Jacqueline. What is the biggest challenge you have faced in your advocacy work?
Probably misinformation and disinformation about our movement. There's been a huge right-wing campaign to misinform and disinform people about who we are, from white people to Black people. And because we're now in the age of social media, that misinformation, disinformation spreads. And it could be very difficult to keep up with it and challenge it.
And do you think that you've been successful in challenging it?
Yes and no. I think that we need more people who are advocates of Black Lives Matter to speak up on our behalf. People don't realize that the right-wing media machine is massive. It's not just Fox News. They are, across YouTube, every single social media platform they have used as a way to target and impact our movement.
Another question from Alex. How do the fights against racism and against homophobia interact? How do we rightfully support Black queer individuals?
What was the first part of the question?
How do the fights against racism and against homophobia interact? It's about intersectionality, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's, Kimberly Crenshaw said it best. She created the term intersectionality. We have to fight all the isms and all the phobias. We can't say that we're just going to fight this one thing first. That we have to see these oppressions at the intersections. And from there, we have to be really clear about who we're fighting for and why.
And how does the fact that a church was so central to the civil rights movement first, and there is in certain church a certain narrative against homosexuality that maybe is challenged by more and more pastors and ministers, but how did it? How does the new movement did emancipate itself from that narrative?
I don't know how we did it.
But you
I
did
don't. It's a great question. I think that we were, a generation who was ready for something new, to communicate something different. And I think every generation has that. Every generation has, a generation of people who are like, I'm going to be all of me. I don't care what you think. There was a huge LGBTQ movement during the 60s and 70s. And while they didn't get the same visibility that we're getting now, those are our ancestors. Those are many of them have become ancestors. Some say transcestors. Those are our community members. And I think that we just weren't willing to be unashamed. We weren't willing to be ashamed.
A question from Maya. Angela Davis said yesterday that we can't relax now just because the US president has changed. What are the most urgent reforms awaited by Black Lives Matter, and how to hold the administration accountable?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. One, a big piece of our work is to really push for the Breathe Act, which is our omnibus bill that really looks at taking away, putting money back into the Black community, a deep reinvestment into our communities and neighborhoods. So that is a critical bill that we've been pushing for Congress to bring in to the House and to really have a conversation about the Breathe Act. And then I think for us, challenging white supremacists and white supremacist violence in groups. Those are two big, immediate actions that Congress can take now.
During the campaign, you were a supporter of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and you said that, according to you, Joe Biden was representing the old guard. So, what do you think about the fact that he was elected, and do you think that you will be able to deal with this election?
It's challenging. I think that in some ways, this President Biden and Vice President Harris are obviously doing a better job than Donald Trump was and did. And there are we will continue to have to pressure them. We will continue to have to pressure them to do right by our movement. And I think that's going to take a ton of work. It's not going to happen overnight.
During the time when Barack Obama was president, there was a task force that was created at the White House around the topic of Black Lives Matter. Is that work restarted by the Biden administration?
I believe so. It was the 21st Century Policing Task Force. And here's the thing. Our movement is asking for no more money to police. We do not need to give police any more money. So if there's going to be any legislation or any efforts that promote more money towards law enforcement, we are going to respectfully decline. And we're going to keep pushing for moving money away from law enforcement and back into our communities.
There is another question from Emmanuel. The BLM movement versus the Black Panthers, is it an identical sequel or not? What are the differences?
One more time.
The BLM movement versus the Black Panthers, is it an identical sequel or not? What are the differences?
It's not identical, but we definitely we are definitely inspired by the Panthers. We are inspired by the work of the Panthers and what they did and what they represented and how they were in Black community. What people don't realize is the Panthers, they created an entire program called Survival Until Revolution. They were taking care of Black people every single day as they were challenging the state, challenging the police. And they were also looking into electoral politics. The Black Panther Party was supposed to be a viable party. It wasn't just about another organization. They were trying to build out a political party. They're trying to build power for Black people so that Black people can determine our own destinies. But I think for us, our movement is inspired by the Panthers, but we aren't the Panthers, and we wouldn't try to replicate what the Panthers are doing either.
The Panthers were also inspired by Marxism and communism. Are you in line with also that ideology and the fact of focusing on social support and socio-economic equality?
Yeah, I mean, I've been trained in a lot of different theories, Marxism being one of them, and there's parts of Marxism that I deeply believe in, and I think that we should be moving towards. Black Lives Matter, our organization, is not a Marxist organization. We are an organization for social justice and social good, but my own personal training is from a Marxist background.
Thank you. Iris is also asking a question. Do you think awareness about intersectionality is growing?
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to hear if it's growing on the European side, but definitely in the United States. It's a huge conversation, and a lot of new organizations in particular are really invested in intersectionality.
Another question from Aurelia. What are your expectations for the future of Black people? Are you enthusiastic about the future?
Yeah, I'm enthusiastic about the future. I think there's, 4 years of living under a fascist government was terrifying. And so to be able to have a breath of fresh air in this new government, I think is really helpful. And at the same breath, there's so much more work we need to do. But I feel very excited about the work that our organization is doing, that BLM is doing in particular, and that so many other Black-led organizations are doing across the country.
And how do you, because Black Lives Matter was founded, was raised on social media. What is the use that you have today of social media?
What are my views today of social media?
Yes, like how do you use it in your activism and to connect?
It's a primary communicator for us. Across our social media platforms for BLM, I think we have about 10 million followers. So it's a very important communicator for us. It's a place where we're able to tell our message and share our message.
So there is another question. We were in the midst of the pandemic, but the BLM mobilization emerged bigger than ever following the Floyd murder. Why, after the specific policies, violence, act of brutality in this specific time? And
I don't know. I think every moment there's an opportunity to, well, I think there's a number of reasons. This is my theory. You know, no scientific proof here, but I think people were sitting in their homes, and there was more. People were already pissed off at the government and how it was how they were relating to COVID-19, and then I think witnessing someone die in your living room, and witnessing that happen in real time really impacted people and made people want to go to the streets. Also, but BLM has been around for 7 years. So our movement has been yelling this same reprieve for years. And I think people en masse finally said, you know what, we got to stand up for Black people now.
So another question from Estelle. What are the views of BLM on education and schools?
That's too vague. I don't know what that means. We believe in education and we believe in schools. I don't know how to answer that question.
Maybe it's about the school system in the US, and are you trying to push for a change, or are you supporting some schooling for people who are disadvantaged?
Got it. Okay. Well, I will say is many of our local chapters, a part of Black Lives Matter Grassroots, are focusing on the school to prison pipeline and ending the school to prison pipeline. Here in Los Angeles, young people were being stopped and frisked in their schools randomly, and that has ended. And now they're working to get cops off of campuses inside of schools. In Canada, they were able to get cops off of campuses in the Ontario School District. So yeah, that is a primary focus of ours.
Thank you. I think it was the last question. Thank you very much for answering to all the questions and who for helping us knowing more about your activism, about the Black Lives Matter movement. It was very, very interesting, and the thing that is very interesting is how global what you were speaking about regarding the anti-Blackness is. So thank you very much, Patrisse Cullors, for sharing your knowledge and experience. It was a pleasure to see you. Thank you for following the conversation. Merci beaucoup. Thanks to the festival, and have a great evening. Bye.